Margaret Thompson's hands shook as she gripped the white roses. The cold morning air made her breath come out in small clouds. She stood outside the tall iron gates of Willowbrook Cemetery, looking at the familiar entrance she had walked through so many times before. At 68 years old, Margaret had everything money could buy. She owned the biggest office building in London's business district. Her company had made her one of the richest women in England. But all her money meant nothing when she thought about her son Thomas. Thomas had died 5 years ago in a car crash. He was only 30 years old. Every single day since then, Margaret woke up thinking it was her fault. She had spent Thomas's whole life working. She was always in meetings or on phone calls. She never had time to really talk to her son or learn about his life. Now Thomas was gone forever, and Margaret would never get another chance. The cemetery was very quiet this morning. Margaret could only hear birds singing in the big oak trees, and the sound of her expensive black shoes on the stone path. She walked the same route she took every month to visit Thomas's grave. Margaret always brought white roses because they were Thomas's favor. I'd flowers when he was a little boy. She remembered how he used to pick them from their garden and give them to her with a big smile. That was before she became so busy with work that she forgot to notice the small, beautiful things he did. As Margaret walked down the familiar path, she thought about all the things she wished she could tell Thomas. She wanted to say she was sorry for missing his school plays and birthday parties. She wanted to tell him how proud she was of the man he had become. But it was too late for all of that now. When Margaret turned the corner toward Thomas's grave, she stopped walking. Something was different today. There were people at Thomas's resting place. A young woman was sitting on the grass next to the grey stone marker. She had beautiful dark skin and was wearing a simple blue dress that looked old but clean. The woman was crying very quietly, and she was holding the hand of a small boy. The little boy looked about 8 years old. He had bright, curious eyes and was carefully placing colorful drawings on Thomas's grave. Margaret could see the pictures from where she stood. They showed stick figures of people smiling and holding hands. Some of the drawings had hearts and flowers. Margaret felt her chest tighten with anger. This was supposed to be her private place to remember Thomas. She came here alone every month to talk to her son and feel close to him. Who were these strangers, and what right did they have to be here? Margaret walked closer to the grave. Her voice came out sharp and cold. "Excuse me, but this is my son's grave. What are you doing here?" The young woman looked up quickly. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked scared. She was probably about 25 years old. Her blue dress was neat, but showed that she did not have much money. Her hands were rough from hard work. "I'm so sorry," the woman said in a soft voice. "I'm Emma, and this is my son Charlie. We didn't mean to bother you. We can leave right away." Margaret saw the real sadness in Emma's face. The woman was not just pretending to be upset. Her tears were genuine. Margaret's anger started to fade, a little, but she was still confused. "How did you know my son?" Margaret asked. She tried to make her voice gentler. Emma wiped her eyes and stood up slowly. The little boy named Charlie stayed close to his mother's side. He looked up at Margaret with curious eyes, but did not seem afraid. "Mr. Thomas came to our little cafe every morning for 2 years," Emma said. "He was the kindest man I ever met. He always treated me with respect, even when other customers were mean to me." Margaret felt surprised. Thomas had never mentioned going to any cafe. She thought she knew about his daily routine, but apparently she was wrong. Emma continued talking, her voice full of emotion. "When Charlie got very sick last year and I couldn't afford his medicine, your son helped us. He Paid for everything Charlie needed. Mr. Thomas saved my boy's life. Margaret felt like the ground was moving under her feet. Thomas had helped this woman and her child. He had paid for medical care for strangers. Margaret had no idea her son had done anything like this. She looked at little Charlie, who was still holding his colorful drawings. The boy smiled at her shyly. Margaret realized that Thomas had touched these people's lives in a way she never knew about. I thought I knew everything about my son, Margaret said quietly, more to herself than to Emma. Emma's eyes filled with fresh tears. Mr. Thomas talked about you sometimes. He loved you very much, but he was sad that you both were always too busy to really talk. Margaret felt her heart breaking all over again. She had been so wrong about everything. Margaret could not stop staring at Emma and little Charlie. Her mind was full of questions that she had never thought to ask before. How could her son have had a whole other life that she knew nothing about? What do you mean, my son? Helped you? Margaret asked. Thomas never said anything to me about going to a cafe. Emma's voice was soft and kind. But Margaret could hear deep feelings behind her words. Every single morning at exactly 7 o'clock, Mr. Thomas would walk into Rosie's cafe on Baker Street. I worked there as a waitress. He always sat at the same table by the window. Emma sat down on the small stone bench next to Thomas's grave. Charlie climbed up onto his mother's lap and rested his head against her shoulder. The little boy still held his colorful drawings in his small hands. Mr. Thomas always ordered the exact same breakfast, Emma continued. Black coffee with no sugar and 2 pieces of toast with strawberry jam. But he was different from all the other customers who came in. Margaret listened carefully. She was learning things about her son that she had never known in all the years. They lived in the same house. Most people who came to the cafe would eat their food quickly and leave. Emma said, "They barely looked at me when they ordered. But your son was special. He would ask me how my day was going. He wanted to know about Charlie's school and what subjects he liked best. He asked about my dreams and plans for the future." Emma's eyes filled with tears again. But this time they seemed like happy tears mixed with sad ones. When some of the other customers were mean to me because of the way I talk or because my skin is dark, Mr. Thomas would always stand up for me. He would tell them that I was doing a good job and that they should treat me with respect. Margaret felt her own eyes getting wet. This description of Thomas was so different from the quiet, serious man she remembered from their family dinners. At home, Thomas barely talked about his day or asked about hers. They would sit at the big dining table and eat in silence while Margaret checked her phone for work messages. "Your son made me feel like I was important," Emma said. "Like I was. A real person with feelings and dreams. Not just someone whose job was to bring food to tables." That meant everything to me. Charlie looked up at his mother with big, understanding eyes, even though he was only 8 years old. He seemed to know that this conversation was very important. Emma took a deep breath before continuing her story. 3 months ago, Charlie got very sick with his lungs. He has something called asthma, and it got much worse during the winter. The doctor said he needed special medicine that was very expensive. Margaret looked at Charlie, who was breathing normally now, but still looked small and fragile sitting on his mother's lap. "The medicine cost more money than I make in 6 whole months of working," Emma said. "I was already working 3 different jobs, at the cafe in the morning, cleaning offices at night, and helping at a flower shop on weekends. But even with all that work, I could not save enough money fast enough." Emma's voice broke a little as she remembered how scared she had been. "I was so frightened that I might lose Charlie. I did not know what to do or where to get help. I felt completely alone in the world." Charlie reached up and patted his mother's cheek gently, as if he was trying to comfort her about the scary time they had been through together. One morning, when I was working at the cafe, I could not stop crying. Emma said. I was trying to serve coffee and take orders, but tears kept falling down my face. Mr. Thomas noticed right away that something was wrong. Margaret found herself leaning forward, wanting to hear every word about what her son had done. Mr. Thomas asked me what was making me so upset. Emma continued, at first. I did not want to tell him because it was not his problem to worry about. But he was so kind and patient that I finally told him everything about Charlie's sickness and the expensive medicine. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The very next morning, Mr. Thomas came into the cafe with a white envelope. He handed it to me and said it was for Charlie's medicine. When I opened it later, there was enough money inside to pay for all the medicine Charlie needed, plus extra money for our food and rent. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. Thomas really did that. Yes, Emma said, nodding. But he made me promise something very important. He said I should never tell anyone about his help. He told me that when you help other people, it should be private and quiet, not something you talk about to make yourself look good. Emma looked down at Charlie's drawing spread out on Thomas's grave. But Mr. Thomas gave me something even more valuable than money. He gave me hope. He told me that I was doing a wonderful job as a mother and that Charlie was very lucky to have someone who loved him so much. Margaret studied the simple pictures Charlie had drawn. Now she could see that they showed a tall man with a gentle smile giving flowers and gifts to a woman and child. These were not random drawings. They were Charlie's way of remembering and honoring Thomas. We come here every month to visit Mr. Thomas. Emma explained. Charlie makes new pictures based on the stories I tell him about your son. Mr. Thomas became like family to us. Margaret felt something strange happening in her chest. Her heart felt like it was breaking and healing at the exact same time. The next morning, Margaret woke up thinking about Emma and Charlie. She could not stop wondering about the cafe where Thomas had spent his mornings for 30 years. Margaret had followed the same routine every day. She would get dressed in her expensive business clothes, drink coffee in her big empty kitchen, and drive straight to her office building in London. But today felt different. Instead of taking her usual route to work, Margaret turned her car toward Baker Street. She had never been to this part of the city before. Even though she had lived in London her whole life, Margaret drove slowly down Baker Street. Looking at the small shops and old buildings, everything here seemed simpler and more friendly than the busy business district where she worked. She saw a small sign that said Rosie's Cafe hanging over a narrow doorway. Margaret parked her expensive black car across the street from the cafe she sat for a few minutes, looking through the front window of the little restaurant. The cafe was nothing fancy at all. She could see a few small tables, old wooden chairs, and simple decorations on the walls. Through the window, Margaret watched Emma moving between the tables. Emma wore a clean white apron over a simple dress and carried plates of food to different customers. Even though Emma looked tired, she had a warm smile for everyone she served. Margaret took a deep breath and walked across the street. When she opened the cafe door, she heard the sounds of normal people starting their day. She could smell fresh coffee, bacon cooking, and toast being made in the kitchen. The customers in the cafe were working people getting breakfast before their jobs started. Margaret saw men in construction clothes, women who worked in shops, and bus drivers still wearing their uniforms. Everyone looked friendly and comfortable, like they came here often. Margaret chose a small table in the corner where she could watch everything that happened. She felt very different from all the other customers in her expensive clothes and jewelry, but nobody stared at her or made her feel unwelcome. Emma was serving an old man at a table near the kitchen. The man was complaining very loudly about his breakfast. "These eggs are too cold," he said in an angry voice. "I asked for them hot, not cold." Margaret watched as Emma listened patiently to the man's complaints. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Jenkins," Emma said in a calm, polite voice. "Let me take your plate back to the kitchen and get you fresh hot eggs right away." The old man said something mean about foreign workers under his breath. But Emma pretended not to hear him. She just smiled, picked up his plate, and walked back toward the kitchen to get him new food. Margaret felt angry listening to the rude man. But she also felt proud watching how Emma handled the situation. Emma stayed calm and professional. Even when the customer was being unfair to her. When Emma finished helping Mr. Jenkins, she noticed Margaret sitting at the corner table. Emma's face showed surprise and worry. She walked over slowly, wiping her hands on her white apron. "Mrs. Thompson," Emma said quietly, "is everything okay? You did not need to come all the way here." Margaret looked round the small cafe, trying to picture Thomas sitting here every morning for 2 years. "I wanted to see the place where my son spent his time," Margaret said. "Can you show me which table he always used?" Emma's worried expression changed to a gentle smile. She seemed happy to share this memory of Thomas. "Of course," Emma said. "Follow me." Emma led Margaret to a table right next to the big front window. The table had a perfect view of the busy street outside, where people were walking quickly to catch buses and get to their jobs. "Mr. Thomas always sat right here in this chair," Emma said, pulling out the chair for Margaret. "He told me he enjoyed watching all the people hurrying to work in the morning. He said it reminded him that every single person walking by had their own important story and dreams." Margaret sat down in the exact same chair where Thomas had sat every day. For the first time in 5 years, she felt truly close to her son. She could almost imagine him sitting here, drinking his coffee and watching the world go by. "What kinds of things did you and Thomas talk about?" Margaret asked. Emma sat down in the chair across from her, the same place she must have sat when she talked with Thomas. "We talked about everything," Emma said with a warm smile. "He told me stories about places he had traveled to for work. He talked about a charity foundation he had started to help sick children get the medicine they needed." Margaret felt shocked again. "Thomas had a charity foundation?" Emma nodded. "Yes, he started it a few years ago after someone very important to him had died. He never told me exactly who it was, but I could see deep sadness in his eyes whenever he mentioned it. He said he wanted to help children and families so they would not have to feel the same pain he was feeling." Suddenly Margaret understood. Thomas had started helping other people after his father died of cancer. Margaret had been so busy with her own sadness that she never noticed Thomas was hurting too. "Mrs. Thompson," Emma said softly, "your son talked about you very often. He loved you so much, but he was worried that you were sad and lonely all the time. He really wanted to find a way to make you proud of the man he had become." Margaret felt warm tears running down her face. All these years, she thought Thomas did not care about their relationship, but he had been trying to honor their family by being kind to other people. Over the next few weeks, something strange and wonderful happened to Margaret. Every morning, instead of going straight to her office, she found herself driving to Baker Street. She would park her car outside Rosie's cafe and go inside to sit at Thomas's table by the window. Margaret would order the same breakfast that Thomas always had: black coffee with no sugar and toast with strawberry jam. She would sit in his chair and watch Emma work, trying to understand what had made her son love this simple place so much. Day by day, Margaret began to see what Thomas had seen. Emma was not just a waitress bringing food to tables. She was like the heart of the whole cafe. Emma remembered every customer's name and their favorite orders. She asked about their families and their jobs. She made everyone feel important and welcomed. Margaret watched Emma serve coffee to Mrs. Baker, an old woman who came in every Tuesday. Emma always remembered that Mrs. Baker liked extra cream and would ask about her cat. When Mr. Rodriguez, a construction worker, looked tired, Emma would give him an extra piece of toast without charging him for it. Even when customers were rude or impatient, Emma never got angry. She would smile and try harder to make them happy. Margaret began to understand why Thomas had been drawn to Emma's kindness and why he had wanted to help her. One morning when Margaret arrived at the cafe, she immediately noticed that something was wrong. Emma was moving slowly between the tables, and her usual bright smile was missing. In the corner of the cafe, Charlie was sitting by himself, coughing very badly. His face looked pale and tired. Margaret walked over to Emma, who was wiping down tables with shaking hands. "Emma, is Charlie feeling all right?" Margaret asked with concern. Emma's eyes filled up with tears that she was trying hard not to let fall. "His breathing sickness is getting much worse," Emma said quietly. "The doctor told me yesterday that Charlie needs a new breathing machine and some expensive tests to check his lungs." Margaret looked over at Charlie, who was struggling to breathe normally. The little boy was trying to be brave, but Margaret could see he was scared and not feeling well. "The new breathing machine costs more money than I can save," Emma continued. "I have been working extra hours at night, cleaning more offices after the cafe closes. But even with all that work, I still do not have enough money, and our rent is due next week too." Margaret felt her heart breaking as she listened to Emma's problems. This was exactly the same kind of situation where Thomas had stepped in to help before. Margaret could almost hear her son's voice telling her what she should do. "How much money do you need for everything?" Margaret asked. Emma looked surprised and worried. "Oh no, Mrs. Thompson," Emma said quickly. "I was not asking you for money. You have already been so kind to us just by coming here and being our friend. I will find a way to solve this problem myself." But Margaret had already decided what she was going to do. That same afternoon, she drove to her bank in the city center. She took out enough money to pay for Charlie's medical care and Emma's rent. Then she drove to the old apartment building where Emma and Charlie lived. Margaret found the building manager and paid 3 months of Emma's rent in advance. She also left extra money specifically for Charlie's breathing machine and doctor visits. She asked the manager to tell Emma that everything was taken care of. The next morning, Emma came to work at the cafe with tears streaming down her face. She walked straight to Margaret's table, where Margaret was drinking her coffee and reading the newspaper. "Mrs. Thompson, I cannot accept all this money," Emma said. "It is too much. You have already done more for us than anyone ever has." Margaret stood up and took both of Emma's hands in her own. Margaret's hands were soft from years of office work, while Emma's hands were rough from cleaning and serving food. But in that moment, they felt like family holding each other. "My dear Emma," Margaret said gently, "Thomas would have done exactly the same thing if he were still here. By helping you and Charlie, I am continuing the work that my son started. I am doing what he would want me to do." Margaret looked over at Charlie, who was breathing much better now that he had his new medicine. "Besides, you and Charlie are not alone anymore. Charlie reminds me so much of Thomas when he was a little boy, always curious about everything, always kind to others, and full of big dreams." Emma sat down next to Margaret, and Charlie came over from his corner tables. The little boy climbed up onto Margaret's lap without being shy. For the first time in 5 years since Thomas died, Margaret felt the wonderful feeling of holding a child in her arms again, you know. Margaret said softly while stroking Charlie's hair, I have been thinking about something important. Thomas had a charity foundation to help families like yours, but I closed it after he died because I did not know how to run it properly. Maybe you could help me start it again. Emma's eyes opened wide with surprise. Me. But I am just a waitress who serves coffee and cleans tables. Margaret smiled and shook her head. You are much more than that, Emma. You have the most important thing needed to help other people. You understand what it feels like to need help. And you know how to give help to others with kindness. Thomas saw that special quality in you. And now I see it to double quotes. Charlie looked up at Margaret with his bright, smart eyes. Are you going to be my grandmother now? He asked in his innocent child's voice. Margaret felt her heart fill up completely with love and happiness. If that would be okay with you and your mother, I would be very honored to be your family. 1 year had passed since that first day when Margaret met Emma and Charlie at Thomas's grave. Now Margaret stood in the same place again. But everything was completely different. She was not alone anymore. Emma was holding her left hand, and Charlie was holding her right hand. The three of them had become a real family. The autumn leaves were falling gently round them as they stood together looking at Thomas's headstone. Margaret felt peaceful and happy instead of sad and lonely like she used to feel when she came here by herself. Charlie was bouncing up and down with excitement. He was now 9 years old and had grown taller over the past year. His breathing was much better thanks to his new medicine, and his cheeks were pink and healthy. Tell him about the foundation, Charlie whispered loudly to Margaret. He could barely contain his excitement about sharing their good news with Thomas. Margaret smiled down at the boy who had brought so much joy and laughter back into her life. She squeezed his hand gently and began to speak to Thomas's grave as if her son could hear every word. Well, Thomas, we have some wonderful news to share with you. Margaret said, we reopened your charity foundation, and it is helping more people than ever before. Emma is now the director of the whole foundation, and this year we have been able to help 50 different families pay for medicine, rent, and food. Emma stood quietly beside Margaret, but her face was glowing with pride. Over the past year, Emma had finished her college degree to become a teacher, with Margaret paying for all her classes and books. Emma was brilliant at understanding what families needed most and how to help them in the best way. And guess what else? Mr. Thomas, Charlie added, pulling a new drawing out of his backpack. I helped design our new logo for the foundation. Look, Charlie placed his newest artwork on Thomas's grave next to the flowers Margaret had brought. This drawing showed 3 people standing together under a bright rainbow. One was a tall woman with gray hair. One was a woman with dark skin wearing a blue dress. And one was a small boy with a big smile. I made the logo a heart with wings, Charlie explained proudly, because I told Mrs. Margaret that kindness should fly to everyone who needs it, just like birds fly all over the sky. Margaret felt her eyes getting wet with happy tears. Charlie had such a pure and beautiful way of thinking about helping other people. His ideas for the foundation were often the best ones they used. Mrs. Margaret is teaching me how to play piano, Charlie continued excitedly. And Mom is teaching me how to cook real food. Not just sandwiches. We have dinner together every single Sunday at Mrs. Margaret's house, and sometimes I sleep over on weekends. Margaret had made many big changes in her life over the past year. She had sold her huge, empty house in the expensive part of London and bought a smaller, warmer house, just 2 streets away from Emma and Charlie's apartment. For the first time in many years, Margaret's home was full of noise and laughter and life. Her new house had a piano in the living room where she taught Charlie to play simple songs. The kitchen always smelled like the meals Emma cooked for their Sunday dinners. Charlie's homework was often spread out on the dining room table, and his drawings covered the refrigerator. The best part of everything we have done, Emma said softly, is that we opened a brand new cafe too. We call it Thomas's Table, and it is a very special place. Margaret nodded and smiled. Thomas's Table was their proudest achievement. It was a cafe where anyone could come for a free hot meal if they did not have enough money to buy food. They had put a wooden sign by the front door that said everyone has a story worth hearing. People come to Thomas's Table when they are hungry or lonely or scared. Emma explained to Thomas's grave. We give them food, but we also listen to their problems and try to help them find solutions. It is like what your son used to do for me at Rosie's Cafe, but now we can help many more people. Margaret looked down at Charlie's drawing again. In his picture, there was a tall figure with wings floating above the three people under the rainbow. Margaret knew that Charlie had drawn Thomas watching over them from heaven. I finally understand something very important, Margaret whispered to her son's headstone. You did not just help Emma and Charlie when you were alive. You brought all of us together to become a family. Through your kindness to them, you taught me how to be a better mother, how to be a grandmother, and most importantly, how to open my heart to love again. Charlie tugged on Margaret's coat sleeve and looked up at her with his bright, curious eyes. Do you think Mr. Thomas can see us from heaven? Do you think he knows that we are a family now? Margaret looked at Charlie, who now called her Grandma Margaret. She looked at Emma, who had become like the daughter she never had. She thought about all the families they were helping through the foundation and all the people they fed at Thomas's Table. I think he can see us very clearly, Charlie, Margaret said, and I think he is very proud of the family we have become and all the good things we are doing together. As the three of them walked away from the cemetery holding hands, Margaret realized that her grief had changed into gratitude. She had lost her son, but she had gained a daughter and a grandson. She had learned that love grows bigger when you share it with others, and that the best way to remember someone you love is to continue the kind work they started. The end.